the task of introducing a speaker means I'm not really going to be the speaker. So you'll have to wait till we do our panel on how not to get busted tomorrow afternoon. And I'm going to just introduce Tom the best way I know how, by being contrarian to something Paul, the executive chair, said moments ago, when he referred to you all as angels for being here. Well, let me share something with you about the marijuana reform movement and activism in America. We don't need angels. We need warriors. And that's why it's a pleasure to have somebody like Tom Hayden to bring to you. Because I shared this with Tom, and I shared it, and Keith shared it with me, and I talked to some of the students that were here last night. And many of them did not know about necessarily that much about Tom Hayden. They didn't know about the Chicago 7, you guys didn't know about the band Chicago. And I'm not referring just to you guys at the University of Central Florida. If you believe in participatory democracy, then you believe in Tom Hayden and what he brings to the table. Not only in 2 decades here as a legislator right here in California, as an assemblyman pushing forth over 100 progressive bills, but in his years as a freedom rider. It was in Mississippi in the 1960s, before he led with 7 other students a challenge to the Democratic National Convention opposing a war in Vietnam that led to him getting arrested, maced, gassed, beat up, charged, and prosecuted before a moronic judge in a federal district court in Washington, in Chicago. And you may have heard about it. It was called The Trial of the Chicago 7. It's been made into movies and books. And his lawyer was Mr. Consulate. That's the history that Tom brings to the table. But that fight against the war in Vietnam, he brings today to the fight against the war in Afghanistan. He is not only active in the Peace and Justice Center here in Southern California, he has started and worked with individuals now prosecuting the Caravan for Peace. Because the truth is, you can't just be an angel. You have to be a warrior. You have to be able to fight for peace. And Tom Hayden has been a contrarian and an activist and somebody who has always been willing to stand naked against the cannon. And the truth of the matter is, so have so many of you. One of the speakers that Alan didn't mention, I think if Dale has set it up, will be Robert Platchon, who served the longest time ever for the possession of marijuana in America, 30 years in a federal prison. He's now 69 years old with cancer, on 10 years parole following his 30-year sentence, and the U.S. Parole Commission said they're not letting him travel and speak at a pot conference because he might be associating with marijuana users. Think about it, in the year 2012. And we might have him on Skype. But the point is that we still need today warriors. And it's a pleasure to introduce someone who has been a champion for social justice and a warrior for the common good, and somebody who has never been willing to accept the status quo because the status quo isn't always so good. Let me introduce you to Tom Hayden.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Norm Kent, who I met on a baseball field 25 or 30 years ago, and later in Miami, who asked me to come and speak to you today. And I want to acknowledge one of my oldest friends, Freddie Gardner, who's been chronicling this movement for many years, and of course Martin Lee, whose books have informed a great many of us, and I've used in my research and writings. And all of the rest of you who are here, I feel a little awkward because I think this was the only time slot in the conference that was open what I have to say, it may be important, but is not central to your normal business. And by the way, congratulations on many decades of continuous activity. There was an interview with some of the feminist battlers for the right for women to vote, who reflected back on that 100-year struggle for the vote. And I remember them saying that they never realized that the people that started the movement would be dead long before it accomplished its task, and the people who came later would not know where it had originated. It is just a law of social change that it comes painfully inch by inch, and each inch is sacred ground. It comes over time. So you use your time well, you have meaningful experiences, but the actual change is so painfully long, and I congratulate your organization for being at it for so long. Now, the reason that I was asked to come, I believe, is that I'm a writer for The Nation magazine, and I follow a lot of the relationship between in the Americas. Here in Southern California, we are in former Mexico. We are on the border of Central America. Our population is heavily Mexican and Latino. I see the balance of things in the world very much from that perspective of the Americas, as opposed to the customary East-West perspectives that inform our national debate. And I've been following the events in Mexico and Central America with the drug war for quite some time, and have made several visits to prisons in Honduras and meetings in El Salvador and trips to Mexico, and tried to report and break the relative silence in North America towards events right here on our border, in our midst, just minutes away, hours away, like the drug war. And I went to cover the Mexican election, which returned the old pre-standard bearers to power. But this was after several years of the previous regime that was the Calderon regime, which is now going out of office. And I was astonished at the way that the events in the Mexican drug war were being covered. No one knows the exact numbers, but it's estimated that 60,000 to 70,000 Mexican people have been killed in the drug war in Mexico since 2007. That's in the first year that Calderon came to power, backed by the U.S. Republican Party, by George Bush in particular, and unleashed for the first time the Mexican army in Mexico cities against Mexico's civilian population in constant offensives and battles that left all these people dead. The funding came from the United States, the advisors came from the DEA, the weapons came from the United States illegally over the border. The whole thing was an extension of U.S. national drug policy and national security policy, and it met with terrible silence, I thought, in this country, which was, of course, the country of destination, so-called, for the drugs that had to be suppressed by the use of the Mexican army. So it was not only in Mexico, but the center of gravity of this war has been in Mexico. And so I was quite interested in the movement that started among Mexican victims of drug violence, the movement for peace and dignity. It was led by a poet, Javier Cecilia, whose son Juan was killed in a crossfire last year. And it was a little bit like the phenomenon of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but quite different in other ways. In other words, it was a movement whose hardcore were people that thought of themselves as victims. They had experienced the disappearance of members of their families. 10,000 people at least have been disappeared. The death of people in their families. The beheading of people in their families. The torture, execution of people in their families. The random violence against people in their families. And while most victims' movements, so characterized, play into the hands of law and order with calls for more police, more suppression, in this case, the movement was more along the lines of saying, enough, this has to end. This war is causing more suffering than any suffering it seeks to suppress or prevent. The issue is a corrupt government, a corrupt police force, a corrupt army, a corrupt judicial system and prison system, and tens of thousands of people who are innocently being slaughtered at the behest of the United States. So it should end. Now, what is the peculiarity of this argument? We may think we're so familiar with it, but it's worth pausing. These were people who were not calling for the legalization of drugs, although I think the consensus among them is that marijuana should be legalized. These were people who were calling for an end to the drug war on the assumption that nothing good could come of it, and the further assumption that if it was ended, and only if it was ended, the militarized approach to drugs, would it be possible and necessary to consider alternatives like legalization and a host of other alternatives. So this is not a group of people who are in the stereotype of potheads who want to get high by legalizing marijuana. These are a cross-section of Mexican people who are dying because of the drug war and want it ended as a prelude to restoring their claims of dignity for themselves and more rational and morally intentional alternatives to the war itself. So, Cecilia himself is a man of the left, doesn't belong to political parties, late 60s, poet. He seemed to be able to sum up and channel the feelings of all these people in Mexico. And they started a caravan around the country with hundreds of thousands of people joining. But the core of it was people who had suffered, really suffered, much more than in many grassroots movements that we participate in. It was kind of like a therapeutic experience connected to some political demands. And so many people supported it that the political parties all had to meet with Cecilia, who told me in my interview with him that he was more a follower of Gandhi than any of the other prophetic figures that one might be interested in. And then he believed above all in dialogue. So he would talk to people in the army, in the government, in the presidential office, often to the consternation of the left. But he thought very profoundly. He's a former priest who, or seminarian, whose heroic figure is John the Baptist, and he thought that he could touch the heart, that everybody's heart could be moved by the suffering. And nobody knew what to do with him, but he got tremendous publicity. The movement is very, very big. And then they decided to come to the United States. Now, this is also an unusual footnote of history. I don't remember any group of Mexicans since the mid-1800s who organized to come north over the border to protest policies in the United States. And they got busloads of people, and they went through 25 cities. Yes, they did New York. Yes, they did Los Angeles. But the 25 cities were characterized as cities with large numbers, majorities, people of color. And they were looking for other people who had suffered victimization, violence, incarceration, addiction, and looking to build a community as much as a coalition of people all across the United States. And I had some scheduling difficulties, and I wound up meeting them in Mexico to get a sense of who they were, and then meeting them again in Austin as they came on their way from Austin. They were going Mississippi, Alabama, then north to Chicago, and over to Washington, D.C. And they were an exhausted group of people when I met them at a church in Austin. I spent a couple of days with them. And I just want to point out a couple of things about them that may interest you. I don't have his photo, but if you close your eyes, you can visualize this. As you know, there's a lot of stereotypes, and of course the stereotype that propels the drug war in Mexico is that the people are cockroaches, less than human, probably deserving to die. It was their fault being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What were they doing? As if 60,000 people were all active proponents and organizers and dealers in the drug war, not innocent people or mere human beings. But that myth prevails, so it's very important to these people that they redeem the honor and the dignity of their lost family members. And they get quite in your face about it. And so there was this fellow I met whose name is Raphael. I think it's Raphael Malvito Conway. And you've seen people like this around on Telegraph Avenue or other places. Maybe Freddie knows a few in San Francisco. They appear to be kind of a mixture of a minstrel, a Peter Pan, a hippie. He's no more than 40 years old, and he told me his story that his brother Arturo was shot and killed in Cuernavaca in August 1997. This would have been 15 years before my meeting Raphael. 15 years. And after Arturo was shot, he went through 2 operations in the hospital where his body had to be cut open and divided to repair his damaged organs. He died drowning in his own blood, Raphael told me, with a horrible grimace on his face. The reason Raphael was dressed all in green was in memory of his dead brother Arturo, who loved the forest and loved nature. And Raphael said further that the death of his brother cut the tree of life in our family. So like everybody else on this caravan, Raphael really was trying to put a human face on his brother. That's what it was about. I felt so ashamed. So, this was a peace movement of a different kind. I've been involved in peace movements against the war in Vietnam, the wars in Central America, the wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and so on. And I know how forceful and powerful people in the streets can be, and I know how powerful individual legislators can be, and an objective media can be. I know a lot about the dynamics of peace movements, but it struck me as curious, an important gap in our society, that there hasn't been a peace movement perspective brought against the drug war. Not to the extent that there needs to be or should be, and I suppose it's a matter of framing. It could be a matter of stereotyping, I don't know, but it seems to me that would be a strong complementary demand to medical or legalizing marijuana, because we need obviously a medical approach rather than a military one. Right? So I became interested in writing about this, and I noticed that this was only the tip of a moral movement that is coming. Martin Lee, in this terrific book, Smoke Signals, mentions it, but only briefly, as if the book was being finished when this happened. He pointed out on page 402 that all across Latin America and Central America and Europe, there's been the formation of this global commission calling for an end to the drug war and condemning the U.S. prohibition policies. A report signed by presidents of Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, many European leaders. Interestingly, all of them out of office. They get better when they leave office, don't they? This report represents a sentiment that really was crystallized by the caravan, but also it led to some very powerful face-to-face, even in-your-face opposition to President Obama from Central and Latin American leaders at the Summit of the Americas this past year, which is a conference that's the invention of the United States, involving some of our most important regional allies. There they were, rebuking the U.S. drug policy. And the response was interesting. Biden and then Obama both did a sort of a diplomatic adjustment and said they welcomed the conversation. Let's have the conversation. They said, that's the gesture to the left, Latin America. And then they said, because in any conversation about legalizing drugs, we would win the argument. That was the tip to the status quo. You can view it either way. I viewed it as an opening to a conversation that had never been legitimately justified or undertaken, and that maybe they do have some ideas we haven't thought about from that point of view, but to shift from a military approach to a conversation was an important step that was necessitated by the pressure from south of the border, starting to put some muscle into the moral pressure for legalization here. Because it's difficult for a president or vice president to just accept being completely isolated diplomatically in Central or Latin America. because they won't have a productive conversation about ending the drug war. So if Central and Latin America holds, and I think they're likely to, they might make some side deals, country by country, but if they hold, this means that there can't be another Summit of the Americas with an American president unless the drug policy is changed. This is an important factor in terms of national security and diplomacy for you to consider. There's no, as I said, there's no concrete agreement or consensus on what the alternative should be, although everybody I've interviewed and read thinks that legalization of marijuana is a consensus idea. But the focus is on ending the militarized approach in order to make it necessary to come up with the alternative. There was a July 30th New York Times front page headline that summarizes what I'm saying here. If you haven't seen it, it's very powerful. The headline says, quote, "South America sees drug path to legalization." It included countries like Uruguay, has been mentioned, it wants to become a marijuana republic. I think that's a joke on, or a riff on, Banana Republic. They're running into some opposition there, by the way, from some of the more bourgeois elements. We'll see what happens in Uruguay. But as the Times reported, and I'm quoting again, "Leaders appalled by the spread of drug-related violence are mulling policies that would have once been inconceivable." So, the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, Moises Naim, is even on record now as predicting, and I don't know what kind of grip he has, but he's actually predicting, and I'm quoting, that 2012 will go down as the year when the pillars of Washington's drug policy began to erode.